And now please join me in welcoming Libby Lair, manager of the Holocaust and the United Nations Outreach Program, to the stage to share a few other brief remarks.
Thank you, Samantha, for the introduction, and good evening. This last weekend, Saturday 27, was the International Day of Commemoration in memory of the victims of the Holocaust. I would like to share with you the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres' message on this occasion. Today, we remember the 6 million Jewish men, women, and children who perished in the Holocaust. Countless others also lost their lives as cruelty convulsed the world. Yet, decades since the Second World War, we see the persistence of anti-Semitism and an increase in other forms of prejudice. Neo-Nazis and white supremacy groups are among the main purveyors of extreme hatred. And too often, vile views are moving from the margins to the mainstream of societies and politics. We must stand together against the normalization of hate. Whenever and wherever humanity's values are abandoned, we are all at risk. All of us have a responsibility to quickly, clearly, and decisively resist racism and violence. Through education and understanding, we can build a future of dignity, human rights, and peaceful coexistence for all. The Holocaust is among the worst atrocities that the world has witnessed in the past centuries. One of the main lessons to be learned from the Holocaust is the need to protect the human dignity and human rights of all people, wherever they may be, regardless of their faith, ethnicity, gender, or political beliefs. We at the Holocaust and the United Nations Outreach Program believe that respect for diversity, critical thinking, and open-mindedness are key elements in building a world in which we live peacefully, side by side, with our fellow human beings. This year's theme of the Holocaust Memorial Ceremony is Holocaust Remembrance and Education, Our Shared Responsibility, in which Honorable Judge Thomas Burgenthal, former judge of the International Court of Justice and a Holocaust survivor, will serve as the keynote speaker. I encourage you all to join the live broadcast this Wednesday starting at 11 a.m. As time moves on, fewer survivors who can share their personal stories are living among us, and the responsibility to remember becomes ours. Especially as a third generation, I believe that historical documentation has great importance in keeping the memory alive, as will be discussed tonight. It is our honor to be part of this event with our long-standing partner, the Museum of Jewish Heritage. I would like now to welcome Leff, who is an associate professor of journalism at Northeastern University.
Hi, I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to see all of you. As Samantha indicated, we're also streaming this online, so I also welcome the virtual community. Of all of the commemorations, I think International Holocaust Remembrance is most important to do communally. So again, I'm happy that you're here, and for the online community, you may not be here physically, but I'm sure you are spiritually. I also am very happy to be at the Museum of Jewish Heritage. It's a great museum with a great cause. I also have particular affection for it because of the role of the Morgenthau family in founding and supporting this institution and their unique and inspiring role in bringing Holocaust awareness to the United States. So it's particularly important for me. Another thing that I think is particularly important is this topic, which is, as Libby alluded to, as we move along inevitably, it becomes more important to be able to connect with physical records because sadly we're not going to have the personal records. So this topic, I think, gives us a good indication of how we can do that. So joining us for the panel tonight will be Dr. Elizabeth Anthony, the International Tracing Service and Partnership Programs Manager at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. Stephen Haufek, who's the Chief of Archives Unit of the United Nations Archives and Record Management Section, and Charles Gallagher, who is an Associate Professor of History at Boston College. So how we'll proceed is that each of them will speak for a few minutes, and then we will have a discussion among the four of us, and then at the end we'll open it up for questions. So if you do have questions, please wait till the very end, and we'll have time for that. So Betsy, you want to start?
Thank you, Laurel, and thank you all for being here. My appreciation to the Museum of Jewish Heritage for inviting me, and to Samantha and Laura for all of their hard work in getting us here. So as Laurel mentioned, I am the International Tracing Service Academic Programs Manager at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. And the International Tracing Service Archive opened a little over 10 years ago, and it's already made quite an impact in doing so. Before I go too far, I just want to, I'm sure that everyone has heard of the International Tracing Service, or the ITS, as I will periodically call it throughout. But just to make sure, I just wanted to give a minute of background. You may have heard a Holocaust survivor refer to writing to the Red Cross to learn about their family members or about themselves. To be a little bit more specific, what they really mean is that they wrote to the ITS, which was administered by the Red Cross for a number of decades. And so that may be a way that you've heard about the ITS when you didn't even know you were hearing about it. The International Tracing Service is a collection of more than 35 million multi-page documents. There are more than 200 million digital images in our digital copy of the archive, and we're getting more all the time. This means that the lives of some 17.5 million people are represented in these documents. These documents all came to be together, to be one collection, already starting in 1943, when the Allies anticipated that there would be a refugee crisis after the war. So already in 1943, they were consolidating documents that they were finding that they deemed useful for their future tracing needs. And as the war and the front moved eastward, the Allies moved and brought all those documents with them. And as they liberated concentration camps and as they came across Nazi offices, they scooped up all of the documents that were in their path and finally located all of them in Bad Arolsen, Germany, where these documents have had a permanent home since January 1946. Now, it's called a tracing service, of course. All of these documents were pulled together for the purpose of tracing, so they sorted the documents out into good for tracing and what's not useful for tracing. What's good for tracing are documents that have information about individuals, specific information. These documents were indexed by name, date of birth, and place of birth, and not much else. All of the other documents that they gathered as they liberated camps and found these offices, all these other documents got put into a miscellaneous historical document pile, and they have not been accessible until very recently because they were not indexed or cataloged very well. So now we have access to both sets, the documents that are good for tracing, the documents that could be interesting for thematic research, and of course their overlap. So this larger set of documents includes Nazi wartime documents, documents that were created in Nazi offices and camps, German municipal registrations, that includes company records of foreign forced labor, as well as residencies and other types of things that you would register at a city hall. The larger collection includes lots of displaced persons files that were created in displaced persons camps by international organizations working there. There are seemingly random groups of of files and documents on Nazi medical experiments, the so-called euthanasia program, the Lebensborn program. There's testimony from Nazi trials, and there's a whole huge subunit of administrative records of the ITS, all of these documentation files where they would record their tracing work. So, all of this is now being digitized. It is probably something like 2/3 to 3/4 of the way done. We have a digital copy of these documents in Washington, and I was just telling my colleagues here that we get a new set of data every 9 to 12 months, and the archive grows very quickly and immediately as soon as we get that. So until 2007, the archive was closed to researchers, and only the ITS was doing tracing work there on the ground in Bad Arolsen. With these digital copies, we have one in Washington, as I said, but there are 7 others around the world. With these digital copies, opened up the possibility to do tracing work in other locations, to have more experts doing tracing work for survivors and their families, and to speed up the process and make it more efficient. So the first really big impact that the opening of this archive had was for the work done for survivors and their families. You can make an inquiry if you would like to do tracing about yourself or your family members on our website. And survivors and their families have an interest. I mean, we've all heard these wonderful and amazing stories of reuniting family members, and that still happens on occasion. But more importantly, families want to know the details. They want to know what happened to their relatives, maybe for memorialization, maybe to put a grave marker, maybe to be able to say Kaddish. They also want to secure documentation, the official documentation necessary for compensation claims. All of this is much more available and much more efficiently produced with these digital copy holders around the world. Our Victims Resource Center at the museum serves survivors and their families in this traditional tracing work of the archive. They recently hit the 25,000 mark, which means that they have provided information for 25,000 different cases over the past 10 years or so, which means they've been doing something like 200 or so a month, and it's pretty good. They have a small staff, and they work very hard. The other way that the opening of this archive has impacted the world in this greater field of Holocaust studies is with digitization, we have the possibility to use the archive in new ways. It was originally intended just for tracing, but now we have these digital tools that allow us to search or to sort documents based on new indexing. And this is a huge addition to the field and a huge collection to complement many others. The impact on scholarship includes, first of all, a perfect way, perfect is not the right word, an excellent way, a new way, a way that we did not have before to corroborate survivor testimony. So as scholars have become more and more used to, and now everyone's using oral histories and survivor testimony, it's also good to have this supporting set of documents that can corroborate dates and places and times and things like that. And then, again, with all of these digital tools, we can search this archive thematically rather than just by name. So there are all sorts of new possibilities for scholarly work in the archive. This is what we have recognized at the Mandel Center, and we want to encourage and promote, and we do so through the academic seminars and research workshops, conferences, and publications that we have been producing and will continue to do. So for the future, this archive is growing and changing and in some ways evolving, even though it's not taking on new documentation. And that is because of this technology. The digitization and all of these tools are getting better every month at least. I've been working with this archive for about 5 years, and it's changed the way that I use it and the way that we can use it in those 5 years dramatically. Also in academia, the field of digital humanities and the use of big data is a really big, hot topic, and it's not just a hot topic, it's one that's going to endure and it's going to grow. This archive is ripe for mining, for big data, and different kinds of digital projects, like different kinds of mapping projects and things like that. So to close, I can tell you that the ITS, the ultimate goal of the ITS is to put everything online. This is not going to happen tomorrow, and it's probably not going to happen next year, but it will happen not too long from now, and you'll be able to access this in the comfort of your own home. So the opening of the archive impacts survivors and their families, and then moves to the very significant impact on scholarly work, and soon it will be something that the general public will be able to access at home and use, hopefully easily and hopefully soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello. It's a pleasure to be here this evening, and it's a real honor to be able to speak about the United Nations War Crimes Commission archives, which finally seem to be receiving the attention that they deserve. As mentioned, I'm the archivist at the United Nations here in New York. We have archives of the organization, its departments, peacekeeping operations, political operations around the world, and we also have the archives of some predecessor organizations, international organizations, which existed before the UN itself was set up in 1945, but found a home with us. And so one of those was the United Nations War Crimes Commission, or UNWCC, and I'll be speaking about those archives tonight. I should point out here from the beginning, I'm not a legal scholar or a historian, for that matter. I've not done the sort of intensive research into this collection that others have, so I'm less able to speak about the content in some ways than the actual history of the collection, how it came to be in our custody, what the rules of access are around it, and how it's arranged, how it's described, those sorts of things. But for background and context, the UNWCC was created on the 20th of October, 1943, in London. It consisted of representatives of 17 allied countries, many of whom were in exile there. And when they first met secretly in London, it was amid falling bombs. They successfully, in that context, established a mechanism for prosecuting individuals accused of war crimes. And they did this at a time when the outcome of the war was far from guaranteed, and indeed they were in the midst of it. They grappled with definitions of war crimes, what the scope of their authority would be, matters of enforcement, and 1,000 other issues that still feel intensely contemporary. What they were proposing was revolutionary, and the fact that they were seeking to establish rule of law while still in the throes of war shows how ahead of their time they were. This was not just about retribution, but real justice, and the international character of the commission helped ensure that it would be delivered. For the next 5 years, through to March 1948, the commission managed an efficient and effective judicial mechanism that gathered evidence against foot soldiers and heads of state alike. It did this primarily by supporting those countries where the crimes and trials took place. In total, over 8,000 files detailing specific charges of war crimes in Europe and the Far East were considered by the Commission. These files named some 37,000 individuals suspected of perpetrating war crimes. Unlike the trials at Nuremberg or at today's International Criminal Court, the UNWCC did not prosecute the suspects themselves. The commission had no courtroom or no judges. The way it worked was that it had national offices in the 17 countries that were members. These offices collected evidence and gathered testimony against individuals accused of war crimes. These national offices in occupied and recently liberated countries documented these charges in accordance with standards and definitions established by the Commission. They then sent these charges to the Commission for review. If the UNWCC thought that they were, on the face of it, solid charges, they then listed that individual as a suspected war criminal and gave approval to the member state to proceed with prosecution in its own courts. This work carried on for about 5 years, and by March 1948, they'd finished. During that period, the UNWCC supported both the Tokyo and the Nuremberg trials, as well as thousands of lower-level trials in national jurisdictions. With the closure of the UNWCC, the question became one of its records. This is where the still very young United Nations steps in. Across the Atlantic, here in New York, the UNWCC found a home for its archives. And what better place than this new world organization, which had also been born out of the ashes of World War II and had as its mission to ensure peace and international security. It was soon agreed that the Commission's archives would be transferred to the UN. This happened in 1949, and they've been in our custody ever since. From the records we have relating to the transfer, the UN knew it wanted these archives. It knew they were historically important, and it knew that they would be kept permanently. What it didn't know was how to regulate access to them. The charge files contained names of some 37,000 people who were accused of war crimes. In many cases, even most, these charges had not been put through a judicial process. The thinking at the time was that the UN had certain custodial responsibilities and could not make public what it considered unsubstantiated information and hearsay evidence. As such, the first rules provided access only to those UNWCC archives that did not contain reference to specified individuals charged or suspected of war crimes. This meant most of the meeting minutes and commission documents were open, but the charge files and lists of war criminals were closed. These rules were seemingly accepted by the United Nations Secretary General and Legal Counsel, and accepted by the UNWCC and its members, at least for the first 40 years. Aside from some notable exceptions, it wasn't until 1986 that the access rules were seriously challenged. This challenge was led by then Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, Benjamin Netanyahu. There were a series of articles in the press, some authored by him, many by journalists, which accused the UN of keeping information about war criminals a secret. This was a well-documented debate, which was exacerbated by the discovery that a former Secretary General of the UN had a charge file against him in the UNWCC archives. The result of this attention, in addition to the renewed interest in these archives, was that it spawned highly politicized discussions around access. This ultimately led to high-level consultations with the original 17 members of the UNWCC and a revision of the access rules in 1987. The main difference in the revised rules was the inclusion of 2 clauses which allowed access to the entire collection by 1, governments, and 2, individuals engaged in bona fide research. There were some restrictions, largely effected through bureaucratic and administrative procedures that remained in place and surely prevented what we would consider truly open access, but nonetheless, the archives were largely accessible for the first time ever. There was a flurry of activity in the late 80s when governments, most notably that of Israel, and individual researchers, including journalists and historians, successfully applied for access. In the end, however, it would seem that very little happened in terms of using the archives for scholarly or legal work. Some of this may have been the result of restrictions on reuse, but regardless, there was no avalanche of publications or resurgence of cases against those accused. It was not until 2014 when the rules were interpreted somewhat differently. This new interpretation meant that a government, particularly one of the original 17 members, could request a complete copy of the archives for themselves. Once the copy was in the custody of this country, access could be provided in accordance with their own rules. And this is exactly what happened. The United States formally requested a complete copy, which it subsequently deposited with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. This digital copy, made by the museum using the microfilmed copy of the United Nations, has been open to researchers since 2015. Other member states have also successfully received copies or are in the process of requesting them, and scholarly interest continues to grow. The story of what the UNWCC did, its goals, vision, and the conditions under which it worked is truly incredible. It represents the first large-scale, international, and successful attempt at prosecuting war crimes. And when we consider advancements in the field of law during the 20th and now 21st centuries, I think many would say that international law, particularly international criminal law, clearly stands out as the most important development in that field. I think over the coming decade, as further research into the UNWCC continues, the history of international law will also start to be rewritten in important, if subtle ways. Indeed, this work has already begun. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a real honor to be here, especially as we remember Holocaust Remembrance Week here. It's a deep honor for me to be with you tonight. I've been asked to speak about World War II archives and their impact on humanity in connection to an archive that is closed for the years of World War II. But it is an archive that I still believe can have great impact and seems to have great impact in the public mind and in the scholarly community, even though the archives of the Holy See, the Archivium Secretum Vaticanum, are opened only until March of 1939. The archives of the Vatican are opened by and processed by pontificate. The last opening of the Vatican archives was in 2003, and that opening was finished around 2006. These were the archives of Pope Pius XI, who was Pope from 1922 until March of 1939. And so from March of 1939 until the present, academic research ceases. At least in the official archives of the Holy See. The Vatican Secret Archives has more than 32 miles of books and 53 miles of document shelves. Currently, the prefect for the Vatican Secret Archives is Archbishop Jean-Louis Bruget, who was appointed in June of 2012. I mention this because there are very interesting things that have happened in the last 5 to 7 years that is affecting the research. And one of them was the appointment of Archbishop Bruget, who, when he was appointed, mentioned that he had 3 goals for the archives. The first was conservation, the second was investigation, and then the third was a rather revolutionary goal, revolutionary for the Vatican, where he said that a very fundamental aspect of the Holy See's archival function was what he called drawing attention to hidden diplomacy. And so the idea was that some of the records from the secret archives, particularly connected to diplomacy, might be able to be seen selectively in public. And then, after that statement was made, sometime between 2012 and 2014, a split happened. And there was the archives of the diplomatic corps of the Holy See had always been deposited in what is known as the Archivium Sagrato Vaticanum. But then between 2011 and 2014, we don't know exactly when because it wasn't publicized, the diplomatic archive of the Vatican was removed from the ASV and sent to its own archive. And that move was not publicized, I think, generally or within the academic community. And so now the diplomatic records, and this is key, I think, for World War II, the diplomatic records are located under the auspices of Archbishop Paul Gallagher, the prefect now, or actually he's the Secretary for Relations with States. We would refer to him mainly as the Deputy Undersecretary of State. And by the way, sharing his same last name doesn't give me any privileges trying to get in there. I've tried that, it doesn't work. He's a former nuncio or Vatican ambassador to Burundi, Guatemala, and Australia. He's British, he's from Liverpool. And now he has jurisdiction of the diplomatic archive, which is a key archive, I think, when trying to construct what happened during World War II. In March of 2012, Archbishop Bruget, true to his word, made a selective release of some documents from 1941 and 1942. These were letters from the Vatican's nuncio to Italy, Archbishop Francesco Borgonini Duca, on his visit to an Italian internment camp, camps in southern Italy, where he visited with Jews. And the letters that were selectively released were letters that were ebullient, written from the internees, ebullient about the efforts of the reigning wartime Pope, Pius XII, to help them and give them both physical aid and also strengthen their morale. So this was clearly, these letters were meant to bolster the reputation of Pope Pius XII, who since 1999, with the publication of Hitler's Pope, had come under some great scrutiny. I must say that what I'll do for the short time that I have left is just to give you a nitty-gritty on kind of what it's like to work in the Vatican Secret Archives. It's open to all scholars who have a theological purpose in doing historical research. The Holy See considers history to be church history, particularly to be a sacred science, and so you actually have to prove theological bona fides in order to get access. That's why many journalists these days, unfortunately, do not get access, usually first time around anyway. And so the mechanics here now are that the records for World War II seem to be split. And they're split in 2 ways. Now, the Diplomatic Corps has their archive, and the main repository has theirs. What's interesting is that the documents that you can see for the period leading up to World War II are documents in the ASV that are from the nuncios that are of the documents of the nunciature. In other words, this would be people writing in countries, bishops of the country writing to the Pope's representative. And those letters you can see. That gives actually a very vivid portrayal of the cultural and social scene of the time and what actually is pushing the images and the ideas that are pushing the Vatican to act. But what is missing now is is over in the diplomatic archive, where those letters from the nuncio, the Pope's ambassador in a certain place, to the congregation which makes the decision about the diplomacy, those are now in a separate archive. What I find is unclear is that we have about 2 million papers, 2 million documents, it is alleged, generated during the papacy of Pope Pius XII, who reigned from 1939 to 1958. That is in the process now of being processed for possible release. Every few years, you get various indications in the press about how long it's going to be for those documents to be processed. And I was reading in preparation for this in 2014, a high-level person at the Vatican Secret Archives said it would be 1 or 2 years, and that was more than a few years ago now. So it's unclear, however, whether the documents, when they are released, will be released from the Vatican Secret Archives or from the diplomatic archives, or if there will be distinctions made there. On the ground, doing research there, it's very interesting. I've been able to do research in both archives, and they are both some of the most professional archives I've ever worked in. The workers at the Vatican Secret Archives and the Historico Diplomatico take their job extremely seriously. They're very welcoming, and they're very generous with their time, but they're also very firm. For example, I'm currently writing a book on World War II. It's called The Nazis of Copley Square, and it's about Nazi activity in Boston in the lead up to World War II. And so they had a file on a group that I'm working on, an anti-Semitic group in Boston called the Christian Front. So I went over to the Historico Diplomatico, and for the documents connected to that group that were in a folder file from 1937 through March of 1939, I could have full access to. But the rest of the half of the file that I was working in was kind of plastered together with a tape. If you've ever done sheetrock work in your house, I mean, this was a sort of a sealant that those documents after 1939 you were never going to get into. And those are the types of things, those documents are the documents that are going to be released when this all works itself out, in terms of Pope Francis now making the decision in order to let those records be seen by scholars. But this switch between the two archives, I think, is key, and is something that most people don't know about. A few years ago, when I went to do research in some diplomatic papers, I went to the ASV and they said, I said, I want to look at these papers. They said, well, they're not here. I said, what do you mean they're not here? They were here 2 years ago when I was here. I said, no, they're in a different archive now. I said, well, could you tell me where that archive is? And they said, oh yeah, it's simple. It's over across the Plaza Apostolico. And I said, could you show me the directions? They said, yes, it's in an archive located behind the 40-foot statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And I said, what do you mean? And they said, well, if you go outside and turn right, there's a 40-foot statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And sure enough, I walked. It's the biggest statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary I've ever seen in my life. It has a base about this high, and it doesn't look like there's anything behind it. And the guy says, you go behind the statue. And I said, I can't go behind that statue. It's a solid base. He said, you go behind the statue, you'll find a small door with metal bars on it. You knock on that small door, and a monk will come and open the door. And I'm looking at that, and I said, I'm thinking to myself, you know, everyone's concerned about, you know, Dan Brown things and the Da Vinci Code. You know, do you really want this story to get out there? So sure enough, if you go behind the 40-foot statue of the Blessed Mary and knock on the door, you will go into the diplomatic archive, which again is a very amazing and professional archive. I just wanted to leave on that note. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start with a few remarks of my own before we begin the conversation. And part of the reason for that is because I am not an archivist, as the other panelists are. I'm a researcher. And I've at least used the ITS files. And I think maybe I can give you some sense of how those files are beginning to affect the way we understand the Holocaust and the way we as researchers are doing research. And I do think it's at the forefront, both as Betsy said, in terms of digital history, but also what might be called microhistory, which I think means, you know, we tell the overarching story of the Holocaust, which is, of course, extremely important. And then we've also been telling these intimate stories of survivors, and that, of course, is also important. But there's this other level where you have a theme, but then you can show it and you can illustrate it by using the lives of actual people. So I am working on a project where I'm looking at American universities who turned down requests from professors who had lost their jobs because they were of Jewish descent in Germany and the rest of Europe. And I knew the story of the American side of it, but I wanted to know what happened to these professors when they weren't able to come to the United States. So I went to the ITS, and Betsy was my guide, an excellent guide, I must say. And what I did was what she talked about. So I had this whole list of the names of people, and I went through, and she helped me a lot. And I was able to tell not all of their stories, and maybe you've gotten some of the files since, I have to come back, but at least some of them. And that's, I think, an important addition to history. But as Betsy was also talking about, her archives also serves another function. And I really saw that when I was there, meaning that in addition, I mean, first of all, they're wonderful archivists. They're erudite and sophisticated and know what they're doing. But then they have this whole other job, which is when I was sitting there, you know, just doing my work, I would hear they would be fielding phone calls and visits from third graders working on reports. I'm not kidding about that. Or journalists who had queries that they expected the archivist to answer immediately. Or, and this is, as Betsy was saying, part of the most maybe important work, survivors and their families who wanted to trace what had happened and what their personal experiences were. And in every case, you know, not only did they show the professionalism and expertise you would expect, but they were also incredibly kind and gracious. And I think part of what that illustrates is that when you're working in this area, it's never just scholarship. And I'll add to that by adding my piece of this, which was, you know, in addition to going in there with my 30 names of people, and I was, you know, as I said, able to find out some of what happened, I also wanted to know what happened to Vilma Hedda Kaufman. And Vilma Hedda Kaufman was not a scholar. She was my cousin. She was the niece of my grandmother, who my grandmother brought over after the war from Slovakia. She was the cousin that I grew up with the Central European accent and the blue numbers on her arm. And so I remember I was hesitant when I asked Betsy. It was sort of like, well, I'm doing this whole scholarly thing, but can I check on family too? And she said, of course. And so I looked, and there was, one of the digital copies of that small index card with her name and her date of birth and where she lived. And then it also explained when she arrived at Auschwitz, which was April 4th, 1942. It also indicated that on January 19th, 1945, she was moved from Auschwitz to Ravensbrück. And that she was freed from a subcamp of Ravensbrück on May 2nd, 1945. And the other piece of this that I think connects the historical and the personal that I hope we'll talk about some is what was in those cards was different from what, at least my recollection of what Vilma told us. I mean, she talked about Auschwitz and she talked about her experiences there, but she said that she had been, or at least I think she said, I mean, I was a kid, so maybe I'm imposing this on her story, but that she had been liberated from Bergen-Belsen, not from Ravensbrück. And I think another thing I then discovered, and this is upsetting, but this is, I think, part of what I think we need to talk about, was that there were now historical records that show that the women who were in this particular subcamp she was in were, I use the word hesitantly, liberated by the Russians, by the Soviets, but all of them were raped. And so I wonder if, in telling her story, she was more comfortable saying that it was the British who liberated her from Belsen than the Soviets in Ravensbrück. And I don't know that. She died in 1989. I can't ask her. But I think it begins to show the intersection between the big arcs of history and the personal stories. So it'd be nice if all of you kind of commented on where you think that intersection is. And I think it's even in protecting war criminals, right, or alleged war criminals. How do we handle those personal? I mean, it's easier if we do dispersonal history, right, and talk in big pictures. But once we start getting into the personal stories, it gets more complicated.
Yeah, I mean, when you mention index cards from the International Tracing Service of people who went into and often didn't come out of concentration camps, the index cards that are in the collection of the War Crimes Commission are index cards of accused war criminals. I mean, it's the opposite kind of side of this thing, but you do get very much that personal sense as you're looking at index cards which have a name, a birth date, crimes, or alleged crimes, and it's extremely personal, even if you don't know the people, but to get this sense of that history, yeah.
Well, and I think you did a great job representing my collections, but I would, maybe this is a moment to talk about an extremely personal sub-collection in the ITS, and that is they have a collection of personal effects that were gathered from prisoners in camps as they were, when I say that, I mean camps in Germany and Austria, not camps like when we think of Auschwitz or death camps, but when camps where people might have been sentenced to a specific amount of time to serve for some crime, I say in quotation marks, they would have to give up their personal effects, serve their time, and then theoretically would get their personal effects back. And of course, many people didn't get them back, and they are deposited at the ITS. And so in addition to all of this documentation, there are all of these personal effects that are now indexed by name that you can look through. You can look at a lot of them online on their website, and it's incredibly personal. It's people's wedding rings, it's people's wallets full of family photos, it's letters and jewelry, and really, really moving, touching stuff. And so because this archive is so weird, it's so different than any other one, it's got things like that in it, and these things, everything from an index card to a wedding ring that can be so touching and so powerful and really an instant connection to a person.
And it has names attached to it, too. I was actually going to ask Charlie that when they released these letters that were written from people in camps in southern Italy, did they use the names of the people who wrote the letters? Were those part of the record?
Yes, the letters did have the names of the internees. It was just unclear how much censorship was going on in order to get that letter out. And the statements made were specifically in connection to the single visit and in connection to their estimation of the Pope, whom they had never met. And so it's unclear how much staging is going on in something like that.
And yet there was no hesitation about using the names of the people who wrote this, who might had motives at that point,
Right.
and then also there were political or even propaganda motives now, but that was okay.
Well, yes. Now, personally, as a historian, I'm against selective releasing. There was basically the 12 volumes of the documents of World War II that are released now that were compiled during the 1960s is a selective release. And in my first book, I actually was able to corroborate in tertiary archives how the published documentation doesn't match up in terms of issues connected to anti-Semitism with documents that were originally produced inside the Vatican, which I had access to. And so I think selective releasing causes a problem about persons, about who is suffering, about whose story needs to be told.
I guess maybe this is partially coming from a background as a journalist, but it seems to me there's also, and I think when we look at it historically, I think maybe we just say it's okay, but there are privacy issues. There are, especially I assume that was the concern with the war criminals. And that it would be unfair to include those names. But does history count more? That's a question.
Yeah, it's certainly there have been questions that have come up more recently, and I think they're substantiated by what we've seen over the last 60 years at least, with regard to certain countries in the post-war period being less interested in the prosecution of accused war criminals for political reasons, whether it had to do, whether the continued prosecution of people accused of war crimes could be problematic in the context of the Cold War, for example. We saw with the Ekman trials in the early 60s, or trial in the early 60s, that the United States, at least, if not other countries, knew that he was in Argentina, but hadn't supplied that information to Israel. And there were questions at that time, they were surprised. These Mossad agents showed up and got this guy, and there are, of course, serious questions about territorial sovereignty and issues like that around that, which are outside the scope of this discussion, I think. But nonetheless, there are larger issues at play. Now, I haven't seen any of those issues documented in the United Nations War Crimes Commission records themselves, but you wouldn't, because they finished in 1948. So whether there were larger forces at work to try to prevent access to those records, I don't know. I think there's a lot of historical research that could go into that, little of which would be substantiated from these records themselves, but nonetheless. But it's hard to know whether any of those individuals would have had retribution if their files were made available. Certainly, I understand the United Nations role to say, wait a second, we've now taken custody of this material, and we have obligations to the members, to the commission which transferred it to us, to the states where these people are still living. There had already been a review of these files by the commission and sent back to the member countries. So there was already an opportunity for the prosecution of these individuals. So it could be seen as very irresponsible to start making public these names. That said, it's very hard when you start, getting in a position where you're potentially defending the anonymity of war criminals, so.
And it does seem sort of a connecting theme here is how political all these archives are. I mean, Brett Erelson was too, in different ways. I guess one thing I'd like to ask is where you think we stand now, and then maybe we'll focus in a little bit more on the Vatican, because in the case of your two archives, there was political pressure, and they are now, for the most part, open to researchers. Well, as you indicated, the Vatican archives are not. So, I mean, do you see that those political issues have faded in your case, and then we can turn a little bit more to the Vatican?
It's become easier, and they have faded in certain ways. But actually, this issue of privacy is a real challenge, and it's very interesting whenever we go to meetings of all of the digital copy holders. There are 8 copies: Jerusalem, D.C., London, Bad Arolsen, Brussels, Paris, Warsaw, and Luxembourg City. And each copy is under the privacy restrictions of the country in which it resides. So sometimes I'm having conversations with the French representative. France has the toughest privacy regulations of all of the cities I listed, countries I listed there. Sometimes I don't understand what she's saying, because the concept and the approach to privacy is so different there. It's wide open in Washington. You can see really you can see everything. And of course, I mean, I've done research in the archive on sexual violence, and there's a lot of documentation in those historical records about so-called brothels in concentration camps. And in the US, I can put that stuff anywhere. I could put lists of people's names. I don't necessarily do that. Of course, I think about it, and I think about the people who are there, but it would be illegal in some of these other countries. So anyway, this issue of privacy for ITS is extremely important and internally problematic as we all work together.
But you said you would not include the names, personally.
I would not necessarily. I have not yet so far, because it seems very hard. There are ways to do it without including them, but that's not to say that I wouldn't. I'd have to think.
Right, and it might need to
time.
be contextual too. What was the example, and why would you?
Yeah.
Why would you do it? And what do you? I mean, we're just seeing now new issues about Poland, and I mean, it's not that these things go away. I mean, you're.
Yeah, at this point in time, I don't think there are any risks around privacy. I don't, which is why ultimately, they're open, and I think when we talk about political pressures around these archives, there were intense political, there has been intense political pressure around them, and it's really taken time, to pass, which has allowed that, the member states themselves, which may have had an interest in not having these things released, because these people lived in countries, and so to make these archives open 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when many of these people were still living in member states, would have raised serious questions about, well, why have they not faced any sort of justice? And that could have, you know, could have had serious
So now
political...
just sort of time is at least somewhat
Yeah,
taking care of
and
the
now at
problem.
this point, you know, those questions can still be raised, but they're answered within the context of the past. Oh, we didn't do that because, as opposed to we're not doing anything, right?
Right, so it's a lot, yes,
yeah,
yes.
you know, it's so.
So now I wanted to turn to, and you know, I know you're in a difficult position because I know you're not, I don't want to put you in the position of having to defend the Vatican, and yet maybe you could help us to understand.
Sure.
Because these other institutions sort of felt the political pressure and ultimately decided to make the decision to make pretty much everything available, where the Vatican has still not made that decision. Is there any good reason for it?
Well, so what I have faith in is the people who I know there who are archivists, who work tremendously hard in processing the material in order to make sure that when the time comes, the documents can be released in a professional fashion and open to all people. I know that there are people doing that. They're doing excellent work. One of the enemies in all this is the typewriter. We don't think about it, but over almost 200 nunciatures and the equivalent of consulates around the globe after 1920, between 1920 and 1958, when Pope Pius XII dies, all of those diplomats were using typewriters. And then you have telegraphic cables. It is a huge amount of material to put in order. Now, that having been said, I am very much a proponent of a full and open release as soon as possible because, and I'll step back from the political sense, because the Holy See was the only actor on the international scene at the time that set itself up as a moral arbiter. And part of the Holocaust question, as a person who believes in God, the Holocaust question is a moral question. And I think if we can understand the moral underpinnings of this tragedy, of this travesty, from an outsider's point of view, but from other people who engaged in God talk and believed in God, then that can hopefully bring us together in some way or another in acknowledging sins, in coming to an understanding of humanity, but also in understanding who we are in our human solidarity. And that's a huge hope for archives. But I think those archives can assist in that really what might end up being a reconciliation.
But do you really believe it's the difficulty in putting it all together?
Yeah. So it's the question is, is it really really the
and
process?
Sometimes
question?
actually, I think that typewriters are actually very useful as opposed to trying to read people's handwriting.
One of the reasons I mentioned the split between the ASV and the diplomat, there are different points of view. The Vatican is not single stream or monolithic. There are different points of view about all of this. What it will take is a decision by the Pope. If there's one thing I've learned from writing papal history for a few years now is the Pope can do whatever the Pope wants to do, right? So if the Pope wants it done, he can get it done. I am hopeful that Pope Francis will continue to consider these questions. What
do you?
Yeah.
What's stopping it, though? I mean, this has been going on for 20, 30 years, and I think there was a lot, there have been these currents, too. So you had a Polish Pope, maybe he'll do it. Then you had a German Pope, maybe he'll do it. You'll have, a more maybe enlightened Pope, maybe he'll do it, and yet it hasn't happened.
Yeah, so I hate to keep defaulting, but the people that I talk to who work in the archives do mention this process question. It's just a vast amount of material. So it's not just the the documents connected to the warring powers that have to be released. It's the nunciature in Cuba, it's the nunciature in Guatemala, it's the nunciature in Honduras. All of that has to be processed before the warring states can have their documents released, because it all has to be released at once. And it's the documentation from March of 1939 until the middle of 1958. That's what I'm hearing. But again, you know, there have been these cracks in the system where other members of the archival system have come forward and said, well, it should be 1 or 2 years, and that was a few years ago. It's a tricky question. As a historian, I think we're still also processing the pontificate of Pope Pius XI. But yeah, as I say, I'm hoping.
It's just hard not to conclude that it's to protect the image of that pope. And if there's some other reason.
Right. Yeah, so I think this pope is less invested in some ways because of his pastoral attitude and that in protecting one of his predecessors. I'm also critical because I mean, as a historian, I think you just let the chips fall where they may, and the other thing too is what I would like to push the church for whatever matters, but whatever thorny situations arrive in the documentation in connection to anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, if the church doesn't adopt the theology of the cross, then it's not worth adopting any theology. And so, if the cross was an uncomfortable situation, and if the church cannot put itself in an uncomfortable situation for history to be made known, then the church needs to, I think, do more self-reflection.
Thank you. I think that's a good way to end at least this part of the conversation. Before we are going to take some questions, but we're actually going to start with a question from Dr. Ilya Altman, who's over there. And he is a professor at the Moscow Historical Archival Institute of the Russian State University for the Humanities, and he was very instrumental in opening up the Soviet Holocaust archives during the Perestroika moment. So he's going to let us know a little bit about that, just a few minutes, and then we'll take more general questions.
Thank you very much for the possibility to be today with you. It's extremely interesting papers that I listen. I'm a professional archivist. It for me was very interesting to receive this information about unique funds and archives in the different countries. And also I'm very happy that you raised in the beginning of your discussion the question about the personal letters and diaries. I think the personal documents that today preserve in many families, former survivors, liberators, person who was involved in the events of the Second World War, is extremely important to preserve. Maybe we have a final chance to preserve it in the family archives. And Soviet Union have extremely interesting project in the 70s and 80s when thousands and thousands letters and diaries was collected and preserved in Soviet archives. Today, Russian Holocaust Center, I'm founder of this center, we started to collect letters and diaries and publish it. I think it's a very important question how to impact to society, not only preserve, but publish personal documents. It's very important for a new generation. On the basis of this publication, we publish 4 volumes, letters and diaries, and our students use these documents for their paper for our international contents. And also, I would like to pay attention that during the war, Anti-Fascist Jewish Committee of the Soviet Union was maybe the first body that collected letters and diaries and preparing the famous Black Book. I was involved for publication of this volume. Also, one of the unknown archive in my country, this is military archives. And I would like to give only one example. It's very interesting that some from the summer 1941, during the very difficult battle for the Soviet army, these departments, political departments, collected information about crimes, Nazi crimes, also against Jewish population. But only one example. In 1944, the city of Rovno in western Ukraine, former Poland, was liberated. And Army Department received the letter in Polish language from Jewish prisoners of war. This lady from the ghetto wrote like the last letters to the family. Family lived in Palestine. What Russian did? Translated this letter in Russian and published in the materials about Nazi crime. And in the end, they mentioned the letter was sent to Palestine. For me, it's very how it's cannot possible to send to Palestine during the war. We publish in Ma'ariv newspaper this information, but no answer. And last year, I received a call from professor of history, Jerusalem Jewish University. He was a cousin of the author of this letter. The original preserves the family. So this letter reads the family. I think this example shows to us how it's important to pay attention. And in ITS archive, as I know, also a very interesting part about how was preserved the memory about the Holocaust, like the first publication of the memories and diaries and so on. This is very also interesting example how the personal documents was used during the war, shortly after the war. This is very important direction and collaboration. And also, I would like to mention, we bring to United Nations and open in January 18, and will be closed January 31, this exhibits Holocaust Annihilation, Liberation, Rescue, about the personal fate of the liberators. We know very often about the rape, or listen about it, but at Auschwitz, between these prisoners, no rapes, but Russian doctors from Leningrad with experience how to help sick person survive 7,000 persons, including Otto Frank. In Japan, I found his personal letter that was written February 23, the day of the Red Army. His first letter to her mother to Basel, Switzerland. First words, I was rescued by Russian. And Russian doctors during 6 months helped to him still alive. He visited to his home and found the diary of Otto Frank. Also Primo Levi, if you will be written his memories and so on, you could understand how for prisoners, Jewish prisoners, a meeting with the liberators was very important subject. So I think in the families of the survivors, as well as in the families of the liberators, not only Soviets, but Americans who liberated different camps, should be preserved these letters, this meeting. In our exhibits, we also publish some diaries, Russian soldiers on this case. So I would like to pay attention personal documents.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great point. I think that even probably you, people in the audience, have letters, things that you don't know what to do with, but whatever you do, don't destroy them. Because it is these stories that are now what are filling out Holocaust history. So I think we should now open up to other questions.
Good evening. I'm a Holocaust scholar. And I think when we have to look at this, and you all addressed it to some extent, is it study or is it purpose? What is it? So is it about studying? Is it about purpose? Is it about preventing? And I think what you have is layer upon layer as you talk about. You could take this archive and then you combine it with that testimonial archive, and you'll see different things that all of a sudden put together a story that had missing pieces. And when you take the component of the Holy See, what will happen if we open Pandora's box? I mean, we've created a line of communication, of understanding, of acceptance, and do we want to jeopardize that line of communication and acceptance? Do we want to cause another whole rift? And I think all of those components make fear a motivating factor in how much do we let go, how much do we let, how much is privacy a component, how much isn't it? Do we want to insult those who were the rescuers? Do we want, and you get involved in all these different components instead of just taking it and looking at the whole thing and mapping it out and seeing how each layer falls into play, because everybody's afraid once we open that Pandora's box, we can't close it again. And I think really that's at the crux of when we look at these documents, what the concern is. And I think when people get upset about, well, why don't people see this and why can't we see that? Because we don't want to find out different things. You know, your aunt's beautiful legacy doesn't want to be embarrassed, for lack of better words, or, you know, hurt. She's been through enough. You know, she doesn't need to be through more. So all of these different components.
I mean, just personally, I think when we don't keep, I mean, the only reason it feels bad, even the questions about sexual violence, is because we have treated it in a certain way.
Absolutely.
If we don't treat it that way, if we treat it as part, you know, the whole story is unbelievably painful. So that part of it should not necessarily be more painful. It's just part of an excruciatingly painful story.
And I think what you have to do is take all of those and take the emotion out of it and look at it a little bit more, stand back a little bit from it and say, okay, this is what is, now what do we do from here? Because
did anybody else want to respond to that? I did.
Thank you for that, adding your personal story. It's really important, and I think all of what you've added is really wonderful. Thank you, all of you.
I mean, to this specific point about these lists that I had of these women that were forced into sex slavery. So I should back up a bit and say that, you know, in my previous lifetime, I'm trained as a social worker before I'm trained as a historian, and I spent many years working with Holocaust survivors and their families, and I've heard many different survivors tell their testimony, and then gone home with them, and then, you know, while we're driving back, them say, you know what I would never say. You know what I would never write. And so much, it's as prevalent as, you know, we're seeing all over. It's all over the world for all of time. It's prevalent, and of course, in a situation of war and slavery and oppression like that, it is a part of it, and it needs to be talked about. I just know too many of these women that would not want their names up there.
Right.
It's tough.
No, I agree.
Yeah.
I think there's a mic going around. So.
About the International Tracing Service, the Joint Distribution Committee had a tracing service that it set up at the end of the war. Is that connected at all with the International Tracing Service?
I mean, the International Tracing Service is sort of this big, huge repository for all of these documents that were being collected. And so among the post-war files, there's plenty of joint files included there. There are tons of different smaller organizations and larger organizations conducting tracing work at the end of the war, after the war. And so there's information, there's stuff from Highest, there's stuff from the Joint, there's stuff from Catholic organizations. There are all sorts of different organizations that were basically taking lists of people who were trying to find other people and sending them around the world, and also taking inquiries and working together. So the International Tracing Service, the name might be somewhat misleading. It is a tracing service, but it's not the tracing service, and incorporates many others.
Actually, quick question I had I didn't ask was there any overlap between the War Crimes Commission and the International Tracing Service? I mean, did they get any of the records from the camps or where there's no connection between?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
I mean, there was, no.
Okay.
And just really quickly, at the UN, is one of the predecessor organizations that you have the archives of UNRWA, the United Nations
Yes.
Relief and
Yes, and I think there's probably more overlap there between the Joint Committee's archives and some things in UNRWA, and probably also with the International Tracing Service. That's because UNRWA was providing humanitarian assistance to war-torn countries and assisting with the resettlement of displaced persons, and so there's a more kind of natural overlap there, I suppose. But no, the War Crimes Commission was kind of isolated, I suppose.
You mentioned that there were, in the UN WCC files, 37,000 individuals named as potential war criminals. you have any idea how many of those were ultimately prosecuted by the individual countries?
No, in short. And that's, I think, a very interesting area for more research to happen now, because those, although the national offices, the courts, and often they were military tribunals in the member states, they sometimes submitted reports of the trials they'd carried out, but it wasn't done consistently. So there is some evidence in the records of what was happening in the countries, but those records are really in those countries, and there's, as far as I know, been very, very little research into that, and we may find that in some countries those records no longer exist. We may find that they've, well, like the Vatican archives, not yet been processed and are not available because of, you know, kind of administrative reasons, or maybe they're fully open. It's going to be, yeah, that's a great area for future research, but there are no kind of good numbers there. Certainly thousands around Europe and the Far East, but 1,000, 5,000, you know, it's, yeah.
We'll take two more.
Hi, very quick question. In terms of the ITS, I have vivid memories of having written to Bud Arlson when they first opened up, and it took a really long time. What is the turnaround time now in terms of getting information? And the second part of that question is, if there are personal effects of somebody who was a victim, how do families get those possessions back?
So first, the turnaround time now should be 3 months. And that should be the same for if you write to Bud Arlson or if you write to us. The personal effects have all been indexed by name as well. And so if someone does an inquiry and they request information about a specific person and the personal effects pop up in the search, then the ITS will repatriate the items to the family. That said, they just started a new project where they have a couple of researchers working to find the families. So they're working backwards from the object to the family, and they are also putting the high-resolution images, or they have put them, a lot of them, on their website. You can look at them yourself if you'd like. And if you see something there that is of your family, then they will arrange to return the item. Yeah, afterwards I can write it down for you.
Last question, anyone?
Okay.
Thank you. I actually have a question both about the ITS and the Vatican. In the ITS, I had understood you to say that there was more material to process. Could give you, if I understood that correctly, like what percent, or did I misunderstand that?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
Whether there was more material to process.
Yes, sorry. In the short time we had, there wasn't.
Is there more ITS material to process?
Yes.
And about what percentage of the total material still needs to be processed?
About 25% of it.
Still, okay. And then, Mr. Gallagher, about the Vatican, that you're hopeful that they will release it. On the basis of what are you hopeful?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm hopeful, based on the current pontiff's attitude towards openness and human solidarity. I am that hopefulness is tempered by the fact that Rome is known as the eternal city, and so it's you know, I'm hopeful in the sense that I'm a scholar who sees value in the opening, not just from an academic point of view, but from an interreligious point of view. Again, the question about morality, the question about the Holocaust and morality. I think it's, and for me, it's also a theological question. I would hope that a pope would view it as a theological question. And if he does, then there's even more impetus for an opening to occur. So that's really kind of the only hope that I have. And I think, you know, your question is a revealing one, because I think I might be too rosy and optimistic. But if I kind of give that up, then I'm just going to move into an area of pessimism. And I don't think, as a scholar, I'm grateful to come to an event like this. I go out there and I push. Just little one person at a time, just push. And I don't know any of these big shots over there, but you just keep pushing, and hopefully someday that Pandora's box will open. And there are going to be shadows there, but I think for the church and the Holy See, there are also going to be light. There's going to be light and shadow. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for everyone for coming. And thank you to people who watched us on live streaming too. We appreciate it. Thank you.